Welcome, everybody, to this Compassion Dialogue with Dr. Steve Taylor, hosted by the Spiritual Companions Trust. Steve is one of the UK's leading authors and academics in the field of psychology and spirituality. He's past chair of the Transpersonal Psychology section of the British Psychological Society. He's written many best-selling books, which I believe are translated into maybe 20 languages. And this is his latest book, Adventure, a practical guide to spiritual awakening. I like it. It's wise and it is practical and recommended. So welcome, Steve.
Hi, William. Great to see you again. Lovely
How
to
are
be
you?
here.
How are you today?
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah. How about you?
I am all right. I'm all right.
Good.
So listen, before we get into the deep stuff to do with your academic work and your research and your teaching, I'd love to know what, if anything, was going on in your early years that might have given you a clue or a prompt to where your interest would take you later on.
Interestingly, I recently remembered an experience I'd forgotten about. When I think I just turned 16, and there was a library about a mile away from my house. I grew up in Manchester, in a kind of suburb of Manchester, and there was a library about a mile away. And one night I went to the library. I think it's one of the first times I've been to the library on my own. And I felt drawn to certain books. I remember I borrowed three books from the library. One of them was a book about philosophy. One of them was a book about psi phenomena. And the other one was a book about psychology. And I took these books home and I felt really attracted to them, but I didn't understand them. I didn't understand philosophy really at that age. But I felt drawn to them. I just loved seeing these books and having them near my side. And it's strange in retrospect. Those are the kind of three areas, well, maybe four areas. I'm interested in spirituality, but I'm interested in philosophy, psychology, psi phenomena. So it's like I was sort of, instinctively drawn to those areas. And there was nothing in my upbringing. My upbringing was kind of, non-intellectual, non-religious, non-spiritual. There was really nothing in my upbringing that predisposed me to those areas. It just seemed to be something inside me that was kind of waiting to manifest itself. And for a long time, I felt quite confused because I didn't really understand myself. I didn't really understand where these spiritual or kind of intellectual impulses came from. But later on, I kind of created a framework to understand myself.
But before you were 16, were you having any little psi phenomena type experiences? Was anything happening in your inner life? Maybe you didn't tell your parents about, but that was just a kind of quiet or not so quiet experience for you.
There were certainly spiritual type experiences, again, which I didn't understand at the time, but I used to love being on my own. I didn't have any social skills. I felt uncomfortable in other people's company. So I loved to spend time alone. And sometimes at night, I'd actually go back to my school and wander around the school playing fields at night because it was kind of the only place where I knew where I could be alone and just sort of wander around in a natural environment. And sometimes when I was wandering around the school playing fields at night, I'd have these experiences where everything around me would sort of come to life and become more real. Clouds would become sentient beings, trees would become sentient. I would feel this sense of connection to everything around me, and everything seemed to be in harmony. And I felt I was part of this harmony, and I felt kind of uplifted out of myself. So I had a lot of those type of experiences, but at the time I didn't understand them. So I thought, maybe I'm crazy.
But I don't think even the most sophisticated, educated mystics understand them because they are the mystery, so to speak.
That's true. But I didn't, at that time, I didn't know that these experiences are quite common.
Yeah.
I didn't know other people have them. So it was a real, it was kind of like a revelation when I found out that the experiences are quite common. There's this thing called spiritual experiences or mystical experiences. And there were books about mysticism and about spirituality. It was a revelation when I discovered those books.
Were you a good boy as a teenager, or were you
A good boy.
Yeah, or a little bit Do you have any delinquent tendencies? Because quite often I found with friends of mine who have semi-mystical experiences as kids, that also meant they felt separate from mainstream society and were rebels in a way.
Not really. I was quite a good boy. I was very introverted. So, as I say, I spent a lot of time alone. So I didn't really get involved with gangs or, groups of delinquents. I had a few episodes with drinking, a few sort of excessive moments, bit of experimentation with substances, but nothing particularly delinquent. I always had a sort of quite strong sense of morality. So, and I always sort of, even though my parents didn't really understand me, I didn't really understand them. I felt like I'd kind of been born in the wrong family. But I still respected my parents, and I loved them and didn't want to do anything which would, disturb them or upset them.
So let me just pause with the substances just for a moment, because substances are now very popular in a sense as gateways to altered states of consciousness. Were you doing any substances as a teenager that did interesting things to your brain?
Not so much. I mean, it was mainly alcohol. I was brought up in a very kind of alcohol imbued environment. My father was a big drinker. My brother was a big drinker. So I kind of got involved with drinking, and I experimented with marijuana in my late teens, in my early 20s, a little bit with LSD and magic mushrooms, but nothing particularly excessive. And by that time, I was already aware that there was an association between psychedelics and mystical experiences. So it wasn't really a hedonistic pursuit. It was kind of more of a spiritual.
I mean, just to say, when I was running the program at Alternatives St James's, did a series of my spiritual journey with lots of very well-known speakers, and it turned out that on the circuit of spiritual speakers, more than half had experimented quite consciously with psychedelics. But those of my age, it had been very illegal and very frowned upon. And now, fast forward 40, 50 years, there's actually, psychiatrists using it to enable folk into altered states of consciousness. So were you taking psychedelic substances consciously?
I was, yeah, because I'd read The Doors of Perception. I'd known about the psychedelic era in the late 60s. So it was a conscious experiment to induce mystical experiences. But I quickly realized that it wasn't, the avenue to go down. I quickly realized that it wouldn't lead to permanent enlightenment. That if anything, it would lead to dependency and psychological disturbance. So after a year or two, I abandoned it and followed a more meditative path.
I think that's what most sensible people do. But I'm just wondering whether the actual, like for me, the experiences were actually quite useful in a way, because they reinforced my sense of, oh, yes, there is another dimension. Yes, my brain can do things that are unusual. And there were people who you could have this conversation with, like the conversation we're having now. Ram Dass and Leary were very high profile.
But I found that because I'd had similar experiences before, in a kind of spontaneous way, mainly through contact with nature, I felt that they weren't really giving me anything new. I felt like I could get access to this experience in a more organic way, in a more reliable way. So I didn't find them so useful. And I also found that psychedelics, for me anyway, they were mainly a perceptual experience. They made the world look more interesting, more beautiful, more real. But I didn't have that same inner change that you get through meditation or through organic spiritual experiences. You feel as though something has shifted inside. There's a kind of a deep, rich energy within your being, a sense of harmony within your own being. I didn't get that from psychedelics. So in that sense, they're a bit disappointing.
Yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying. And I think, like, when I listen to friends of mine who lead psychedelic therapy, one of the things they're doing quite consciously, and this kind of echoes what you just said, is they're making sure that inside the experience, it becomes embodied and felt and sensed, and people pull their attention away from the pictorial Disney, the Disneyland type stuff. Anyway, I didn't mean to take us down that as a cul-de-sac, but I find it really interesting to find out what folk were doing in their teens and 20s. And
yeah, for me at that time, I was really, my main purpose was really to try to understand myself. I felt very confused and quite depressed. I even had sort of a lot of suicidal ideation at that time because I didn't understand myself. I thought I was crazy. I thought I would never fit into normal society. I thought I could never function in the world or have proper relationships. So, but once I'd gone, that was a process. By my mid-20s, late 20s, I felt as though I'd been through that process and I was able to function in the world. I was able to be a seemingly outwardly normal human being.
I'm curious as to what took you through that process, because I personally had a similar process, and then I went into psychoanalysis at the age of 22, 23 and did 3 years, basically psychotherapy, to reassure myself that I wasn't bonkers. What took you through the process? Just the passage of time, or was there some therapeutic help?
I didn't have any therapy or anything like that. Meditation was very helpful. I started to meditate regularly, and that was a real stabilizing influence. It really taught me that I didn't have to believe my thoughts. I could kind of step outside my stream of thoughts, and there was a kind of there was a peaceful place within me which wasn't affected by my thoughts, and also which wasn't affected so much by the external circumstances of my life. So yeah, it was a sort of an organic process, really, discovering meditation. Also, a relationship. I met my wife, the lady who's now my wife, which was a very stabilizing influence. And I began to function. I realized that I built up self-confidence and self-esteem. I began to work. Back in those days, I was a teacher who originally taught English. I was also a musician. But I realized I could function. I realized that, people, I could form relationships. People seemed to like me, and I built up some self-esteem, and, became more stable. And that seemed to allow my natural spirituality to inform my whole life, and to, I keep using the word stable, but it was a sort of stabilizing process.
I'm curious about a couple of things you've just said. One was there a particular school of meditation or that you used, or did you self-discover it?
It was a form of Buddhist meditation, and that was only because there was a Buddhist meditation center quite close to me. That was kind of the nearest place to learn meditation. But I've always felt attracted to Buddhism. I wouldn't call myself a Buddhist, but I've always felt attracted to Buddhism. It's quite rational and practical, quite psychological. So yeah, it was a simple Buddhist meditation, which led me to, there was a teacher I used to follow for a long time as well. That this Buddhist center in particular was connected to a teacher who I began to follow in maybe my early 30s, and continued to visit him for a long time.
There are different Buddhist meditation practices ranging from just emptying through to metta, loving kindness, through to more psychically sensitive awarenesses. What school was your teacher in? What
it was Theravada.
Okay.
So the first meditation technique I learned was it was simply observing the breath and counting in parallel with the breath. And then there were different techniques. I learned other techniques later. Later I learned some tantric meditation techniques, which I found helpful. And I still use those techniques now.
And another question from what you were saying a few minutes ago, you kind of let slip that you were also a musician.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm immediately going, classical, hard rock, thrash. What were you?
Well, I was a bass player and a singer. I played in quite a few different forms of music. It was mainly kind of indie type stuff. My favorite band was The Doors. You remember The Doors?
Yeah, of course.
So I tried to sing. I tried to sing a bit like Jim Morrison.
Oh well, no, Jim Morrison wannabe. Whoa.
Yeah, it was a similar kind of.
Did you wear leather?
No, I was playing the bass, so I couldn't really strut around the stage in leather. I had to sort of stand and concentrate on playing the bass. But no, it was. I've always thought that music is. And there's a strong connection between music and spirituality, obviously. So even now, I'm not in a band anymore, but I still play music a lot on my own or with my kids.
Okay, I mean, because the bass player for some people is the person who keeps the band together. You know,
Mhm.
holds the rhythm and keeps them on beat and on track. Were you consciously kind of doing that as almost like a meditation teacher, going this holding the group?
Yeah, I've never thought of that, but it's true. The bass is like the foundation of the band in a way, but along with the drums, the rhythm section, the bass and drums are the foundation. Yeah, yeah. I always had a very strong sense of rhythm, so maybe that's connected to meditation. So I love to sort of lock in with the drummer and just play the same rhythm for, for minutes, for a long, long time, and get sort of it would become hypnotic.
Yeah, so you like to trance out sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the great things about music. You can find a little motif, a little riff, and play it endlessly and endlessly, and it becomes trance-like and becomes automatic, and it becomes meditative.
Because there are a lot of folk who freeze when they're asked to meditate. They find that very frightening and almost imprisoning, but give them music and a rhythm, and they can go right into the zone.
Yeah, yeah. I've become more and more aware that a lot of people do have difficulty with meditation, don't they? It's with sort of pure, you know, traditional meditation. People, find it quite difficult. So
Right.
there are lots of activities that are meditative, like running, swimming, walking, contact with nature. So, I sometimes recommend to people, well, if you find meditation difficult, just try a form of physical meditation, go running, mindful running or mindful swimming is very meditative.
And staying with what you were saying a few minutes ago, you were teaching English in a secondary school.
Not exactly. It was because my musical career, such as it was, led me to Germany. My band did a tour
All
of
right,
Germany.
so let's just pause you for a second. Right,
Sorry.
you've now mentioned the word career in relation to being a bass player, and you're now
Well,
saying took you to Germany, right? Hamburg, possibly.
well, it was a similar story to the Beatles,
Okay, go on.
apart from the fact that we had no success. Um, but yeah, I was in a band. We did a tour of Germany. It was mainly Eastern Germany. We did play Hamburg, but it was mainly Eastern Germany. And I met a girl in Germany, fell in love, and decided to leave the band and stay in Germany. So, so in Germany, I carried on playing music with new musicians, but also I began to teach English because it was Eastern Germany, so nobody could speak English. So there was a lot of demand for learning English. So I began to partly make a living teaching English to German people. So when I
Okay,
returned to England, I carried on doing that.
this is quite an adventure now for the. I mean, people may have the impression of you of being this kind of academic, meditative writer, and now we're finding out that there's a rock and roll musician who falls in love in Germany. The band breaks up. It's
The band breaks up.
it's actually it's very endearing, very very human, and means that because I tend to trust meditators and teachers in this world who have a grounding in the ordinary world, real life.
Yeah, it
So
was a
this is
great adventure. It was kind of a mistake in practical terms because my band actually became quite successful without me.
oh come on, what were they called?
Well, they became successful in Germany, not so much in the UK. They were called the
Okay.
Dostoevskis.
Dostoevsky's.
Yeah, named
Really?
after the novelist.
Okay, so that's quite surreal. So,
Yeah.
I'm,
Um,
I'm a Grateful Dead human being. Just
oh yeah.
you want to park me somewhere? I'm a deadhead.
Oh right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was it was an adventure and it was quite enriching. In a way, it was quite kind of it was a negative experience in one way, in that in Eastern Germany there was no awareness of spirituality at all because after 45 years of communism, any trace of spirituality had been eliminated or religion had been eliminated. Um, so the spiritual aspect of me didn't really have the opportunity to express itself. I didn't meet anybody else who knew anything about spirituality. There were no groups or talks to go to or anything like that. So I became a bit depressed again because the spiritual side of me was being frustrated.
Yeah, but what it does mean years on is that you have a psychological capacity to have very wide boundaries for whom you're working with, and you know what crisis and the
Yeah,
cold,
that's right.
what the cold face is like.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, when I returned from Germany, I felt as though I had nothing left in my life because my
How
relationship had
old were
broken
you?
up. I was 28 at that time when I returned from Germany after a few years, and my relationship had broken up. I'd left my band. I decided to give up playing in bands because I was bored and frustrated with the experience, and it became sort of people in bands always get it was become very hedonistic. It's a very kind of hedonistic lifestyle. So I wanted to get away from all of the drinking and that kind of thing. But I had no career, no sort of prospects. I moved back to my parents' house. So I kind of felt as though I had nothing left. I was kind of beginning again. But in retrospect, that was it was quite transformational to begin again from ground zero and to kind of rebuild my life and rebuild my identity and to reconnect with my spirituality. And that was, I mentioned earlier about discovering meditation. That was when I began to meditate regularly and became a vegetarian and began to practice yoga. So it's kind of like, a new beginning.
I have an insight here which I want to pose to you, just to check out whether it sounds any. Is in my experience, a lot of people who come into spirituality are quite precious and slightly earnest about it, and they tend to tense up in their preciousness, and which means it's difficult for them to connect with the flow. But I would have thought your years in the band and that whole experience would have kind of loosened you up immensely so that
Mm.
when you did come back to meditation, it would have been a much more open and rich experience.
I think so, yeah. And it certainly gave me a lot of life experience too. You get so many experiences when you're traveling around in a band, to different cities and meeting different people. I felt as though, I'd become a mature person. I had lots of experience to draw on and lots of aspects of my personality which needed to be integrated. So it was definitely an enriching experience. And yeah, maybe music, you can't enjoy music without being loose, without sort of relaxing into the moment. You can't really play music effectively without that. So yeah, I think, yeah, maybe there is a connection.
Well, it's just that you already have a kinesthetic, an embodied experience of being in a rhythm and being loose is what I'm thinking of. So you then somehow ever ended up teaching in a school?
No, I was teaching I ended up teaching in a college, like a sixth form college, not
FE
school.
College, yeah.
Yeah, teaching people who were learning English or supporting people who were dyslexic.
Mhm.
So I ended up as a dyslexia support tutor and assessor, assessing people who were dyslexic before I became involved in transpersonal psychology.
So how did that transition happen?
Um, Good question. I was never aware of the field of transpersonal psychology. I'd never even heard of it until I read a book by Ken Wilber. I was probably, let's say, maybe 32 at the time. I just picked up a book by this guy, Ken. I think somebody recommended it. And it said, Ken Wilber is a transpersonal psychologist. And I thought, what is a transpersonal psychologist? What is transpersonal psychology? And so I read up on it. I thought, well, this seems like exactly the kind of thing I'm interested in. Because I was interested in psychology and also spirituality. I had a slightly sort of academic side of my personality. Then I discovered there was a master's degree in transpersonal psychology in Liverpool, quite close to me, run by a chap called Les Lancaster, who you probably met. And I got in contact with Les and met him, and this course seemed absolutely perfect for me. This is exactly what I'm interested in. Studying spirituality from a psychological point of view, studying spiritual experiences, and studying awakening experiences. So I did the master's degree, which led to a PhD, and which led to, I got a role as a lecturer at Leeds Beckett University as a result.
What was your doctoral research?
I'm probably one of the very few people who has a PhD in spiritual awakening. So I basically studied cases of spiritual awakening. I interviewed 25 people who believed that they had become spiritually awakened. and I studied, the factors that had caused their awakening and the characteristics of their new experience of the world.
What was the what was the methodological thread that held it together? Which
it was
required?
I used a methodology called IPA, phenomenological analysis. So it's basically studying people's experience, interviewing them in detail. And the main commonality was that most of them had been through psychological turmoil. They'd been through a kind of bottoming out experience, a bereavement or a diagnosis of cancer, which had led to their spiritual awakening.
And did you come to a conclusion?
Only the main conclusion I came to was there was this strong connection between psychological turmoil and spiritual awakening. And I also found that a lot of people underwent awakening without knowing anything about spirituality at that time. They didn't know anything about meditation or Buddhism. They'd come from a very normal background without exposure to spiritual ideas, but they'd undergone this transformational experience. And their perception of reality had shifted in a major way. They felt like different people living in the same body. Sometimes they felt a bit confused because they weren't really sure why they had changed, or they didn't really know who they were anymore. So it took them a while to adjust to it. But after a while, they slowly gravitated towards spiritual teachings or spiritual books. And then they realized, wow, I'm not crazy. I've undergone some kind of spiritual experience. So they built up a framework to understand what had happened to them.
And did that support your own spiritual practice and development, or was it a purely academic process?
It made me make sense of some of my own experiences because when I was a young man, I did go through a lot of depression. So I wondered if my depression had been reflected or had been manifested, had expressed itself in spirituality, that some of the experiences were caused by my depression. So yeah, it definitely, and I became aware of some of the characteristics that people report in spiritual awakening, some of the qualities, some of the elements that people who undergo awakening, they report certain characteristics, certain elements, which characterize their experiences. So it was very helpful to become aware of those characteristics.
So push back on me if this is too intrusive, but I'm really interested in, you said it made sense of some of your spiritual experiences being triggered by your depression. Or what can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, I mentioned earlier that when I was a young man, I suffered from depression, but intermittently I would have spiritual experiences of harmony with my surroundings, a sense of the interconnectedness of all things. So it did make me wonder if those experiences were triggered by my depression, because deep depression does trigger spiritual experiences, any kind of psychological turmoil. So I wondered if there was kind of like a symbiotic relationship between my early depression and my spiritual experiences.
And do you have a sense of how depression can have this gateway into spiritual experience? What's actually going on is it because there's nowhere else to go for the psyche to go, or what do you think is cooking there?
I think generally, I think there are two ways in which depression or any kind of turmoil can manifest itself in awakening. One is when the pressure just builds up to the point where a person's ego can't withstand it anymore. So the ego collapses in the face of the pressure, just like a building collapses in an earthquake. So that can happen with intense stress over a long period, bringing some kind of breakdown, which becomes a spiritual awakening. Or a long period of depression, also addiction, a long period of addiction can have a similar effect. But also a long period of loss, any kind of turmoil which involves loss, a breakdown of attachments, like, a loss of your ambitions, or a loss of your self-worth, a loss of status and success, a loss of your beliefs. All of these things can also break down the ego. it's almost as if the ego is sort of like it's made up of these building blocks of attachments, like beliefs, ambitions, possessions, and so forth. And when these things are taken away, the ego just collapses. And so it's a process of ego dissolution. And when the ego dissolves, and there's a space for a new self to emerge inside us. So I think in some people there's a kind of latent, spiritually awakened self, which is fully formed. It's just waiting for the opportunity to emerge. So when the ego breaks down, it's like, phew, suddenly this awakened self emerges, like a phoenix, and it becomes their new identity.
All right. So here's a $64,000 question, and I don't want us to become too academic and scholarly about it. What do you mean by ego here? Whose definition of ego are you using?
Well, my definition of the ego is a kind of thought-created identity, an identity which lives from our thoughts and which is sustained by our thoughts. It's sustained by the stories of our lives, the stories of our past, and our ambitions or plans for the future. So it's a kind of thought-orientated, time-orientated, superficial identity.
Superficial?
Yeah, because there is a deeper identity.
That's quite a judgmental turn of phrase.
Well, I think there is a deeper identity beneath it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so when you only need to stop thinking for a while, and then you become aware of the deeper identity.
Right. So the model you have here is when people's social and cultural identity fragments, then they open up to their deeper sense of who they are.
Yeah, that's exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let me circle back to one of your earlier interests as a teenager, right? Which is psi phenomena.
Mm.
So there's a psi phenomena model which might assert that when sense of identity fragments, people open up to a field of energy, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, which can overwhelm them or is beautifully oceanic or comforting, but depending on how they're structured. Is that part of your jigsaw?
That makes sense to me personally. I think certainly when I was younger, I didn't have strong boundaries at all. So I felt kind of overwhelmed by the world, overwhelmed by experience, overwhelmed by other people. And also, yeah, overwhelmed by my own inner sensations. And I think still my boundaries are still quite soft, even though I feel as though I've had to build some kind of boundary to function in the world, but I think my boundaries are still quite soft. And I think when I was younger, and still now, I have occasional psi type of experiences like precognition or telepathic experiences.
Well, then we're in one of which I think turns into a kind of theological division in Buddhism, and also a theological division in Taoism, which is between those folk who are, for want of a better word, slightly empathic and sensitive and open to psychic experiences, and those who are not.
Mm.
Those who are not open or have not experienced psychic or empathic experiences tend to be quite snobbish about the people who are having psychic or sensational experiences, because it's not part of their paradigm. It's not part of their experience.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether that rings a bell with you, what I'm describing.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, they can be quite hostile to the idea of psi experiences. I think people with strong boundaries, they need a strong sense of identity, and they need strong beliefs. I think when your boundaries are quite soft, you don't really need strong beliefs. You can think, oh well, whatever I believe comes from my experience, and my beliefs are open to change. But if you're locked in, if you have a strong ego, strong boundaries, then you need strong beliefs. You need a strong identity, and belief in materialism. Belief that the only reality is physical. That gives them a strong sense of, it's like religion. They're like fundamental religious people, fundamentalist religious people. They have really strong beliefs, and they're really hostile to anybody who has different beliefs. because their identity depends on it. So yeah, there are a lot of really dogmatic, nasty skeptics out there who, who are quite aggressive in the way they demean people who are open to the idea of psi.
And I'm wondering how you, as an academic, thing is, it's possibly because you come under the spirituality umbrella, you can get away with it because the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, Buddha consciousness, Taoist flow, all that kind of stuff is essentially to do with subtle energies, right? But I remember the University of Westminster, which had the biggest holistic health department in Europe, losing all its funding because the senior professors there were into subtle energies, which was then considered completely what you just described, the aggressive fundamentalist materialists.
Yeah.
Controlled the purse strings and where the funding came from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not, I don't hide there are some academics who kind of hide their beliefs in psi or their interest in spirituality or in near-death experiences and other anomalous phenomena. I don't hide my interest, we're quite open about it at my university. But yeah, maybe I think because we're psychologists and, you even if you're a skeptic, you can investigate psi from a psychological perspective. So, and there are lots of skeptical psychologists who investigate near-death experiences and try to explain them away in neurological terms, or try to expose paranormal phenomena as fraudulent. So I guess I've received some hostility. I do receive it occasionally, but my method is always to respond to hostility with kindness and generosity and patience and tolerance. It doesn't get you anywhere if you respond with hostility.
It's wonderful to hear that. I tend to you'll see me running in the opposite direction.
Well, ignoring it that's a strategy too. I sometimes do that as well.
You've got 3 boys, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
How do they regard your interest? They see it as, that's Dad's job. Thank goodness it pays for our food and stuff. Or do they rib you for it, or are they into it?
They make fun of me. They call me spiritual dad sometimes. They call me a hippie sometimes, but they're quite open to it. They're kind of. I've not sort of tried to push my interest on them, but they're quite curious. My 15-year-old has started to read some of my books, and
oh, really?
My oldest son, he lives in London now, but he went to see Eckhart Tolle speak in London, so he's got his own interest in spirituality now. So it seems to be growing organically.
Right. But that's lucky that you have a family like that.
Yeah, they're not rebellious. My kids are not rebellious. They've not become, hardline skeptics in rebellion against me. So
let's move into your current field of work. What's your cutting edge at the moment? What really engages you? What do you
I've become more.
I'd cut across you. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I've become more interested in anomalous states of consciousness. I've begun to study near-death experiences in detail and altered states of consciousness in which people glimpse the future or relive the past. I've just finished a book about what I call time expansion experiences. And time expansion experiences often occur in accidents where a few seconds can stretch into minutes. They can occur when people have falls, where a couple of seconds of a fall can stretch out into minutes or even hours. They occur in near-death experiences where time, in a few seconds, a person can experience 2 weeks of normal time. Or in a life review when they can relive the whole lifetime of experiences in a few seconds. So yeah, I've just finished a book about those experiences, so that's where I'm quite interested in.
But you've just finished writing it.
Well, yeah, I just on this very day I've submitted the copy edit to the publisher.
So, good luck.
Yeah, it'll be published later this year.
Oh, well done.
Thanks.
Do we have a title for it?
It's just called Time Expansion Experiences, with the subtitle "The Illusion of Linear Time."
Okay. All right. The illusion of linear time. That's
Yeah.
this is from someone who took psychedelics decades ago.
Yeah, psychedelics are definitely a source of time expansion.
So can you do you have no, I'm not going to ask you to do an elevator pitch, but do you have an accessible overview of how and why these time warps happen? What's going on? Is there another dimension that people lift into?
Yeah, well, it's related. We were mentioning boundaries. It's related to boundaries. Like the normal human state with a strong ego boundary seems to create a fast-flowing linear sense of time, where time is running away. It's moving quickly and running away, and it's strictly linear, moving into the future from the present, before and the past before then. But in all of the experiences that I've mentioned, in spiritual experiences, psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, near-death, lots of altered states of consciousness, like hypnosis is another one. Linear time fades away. Time opens up. Happens a lot in sport as well. I've got a whole chapter on sporting experiences where people have an expanded sense of time in the so-called zone state in sport. So they're all experiences. They're all altered states of consciousness where our normal ego boundaries fade away, and we, you know, our sense of space changes as well. We feel a sense of connection to our surroundings, even that we may feel that we're out of our bodies observing the scene from above. So my conclusion is that our normal sense of time is created by our normal state of consciousness. So as soon as we slip into altered states, time changes. So time seems to be a construct of our normal state of consciousness.
Okay, so here comes the question that everybody must be wanting me to ask you, which is how come some folk, like my wife, for example, has awareness of things that are going to happen in the future? They just come to her in dreams and visions. What's going on there?
It's because time is essentially spatial. I think at the most fundamental level of reality, the future already exists and the past still exists. So when people glimpse future events, they're just really gazing on this panorama or gaining information from a different part of the panorama. And it fits with physics as well. It fits with the space-time, Einstein's view of space-time, block time. Everything is laid out in spatial terms.
Where does free will sit in the middle of that then?
That's a good question.
Yes, I know it is. Go on, go on.
Free will.
$64,000 if you can answer it.
It's a good question, which is difficult to answer. But I think free will exists to a degree because future events, they don't seem to be set in stone. They seem to be probable rather than fixed. So there are a lot of, maybe your wife has experiences, but there are lots of precognitive experiences which are not precisely accurate. There are some details which are slightly different. And a good example is when people dream of accidents. They dream of themselves having some kind of accident. Then a couple of days later, they realize, oh, this is the scene from my dream. And they take evasive action because of the dream. So obviously the dream is not accurate because in the dream they had the accident. So I think, this relates to physics as well, to quantum physics. Future events seem to be probable, rather than definite. So we have a certain amount of free will in that sense.
QE.
Yeah. Although some people don't believe in free will. A lot of people don't believe in it, do they?
No, but there's another. I mean, there's another Christian mystic approach, which is the beginning and the end. Alpha and Omega are already done, cooked. And in a more Hindu or esoteric Buddhist tradition, it would be that we are all inevitably going to become liberated beings with 100% compassionate consciousness that's fully connected. So we're all going there anyway, and that's complete. That's already complete in terms of whatever the overviewing being thing is, the mystery is. And we're moving in that direction anyway. So the probabilities fit in with that great flow.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a general trend. We are moving in a certain direction, but there is a certain amount of deviation which is possible as well.
Well, that's certainly the case, says the bass player in the German band.
Deviation is in all senses of the term.
Yeah. But it's very curious because I remember that. Do you know Serena Roney-Dougal? She wrote some very interesting social 40. I live in Glastonbury. She lives in Glastonbury, and I was in the High Street. And she got paid to do some research, interviewing psychic Buddhist monks in the Himalaya who had where there was no connections or no wireless, no telephones. And questions she often asked were to do with: is there such a thing as the time in the future and the past? And they would shake their heads and say no. And then she might ask, so what is reincarnation all about? At which point their eyes would swivel and rub their hands and and I think you're right to talk about probabilities, wavelengths of probabilities within an expansive field.
There are many near-death experiences where people are told that they have a choice whether to return to their body or to remain in this kind of ethereal state. And they're often told that if they return to their bodies, this is what will happen. You will have a son, you will get divorced. But but they may decide not to return to the body, in which case that won't happen. So it's probable, but it's not. It's conditional.
So here's a personal question. While you were writing this book over the last year or whatever it took, presumably you're keeping to your daily meditation practice, and presumably what you're writing about is in some way or another informing or relating to what's happening to you when you're sitting. So what kind of change did you personally go through in your meditation writing this book? Because it would have expanded your awareness considerably, I would imagine.
Well, meditation is quite strange. Sometimes when I meditate, time can go really quickly. So I became more aware of the kind of temporal variations that happen in meditation. Occasionally when I meditate, I seem to go into a kind of deep time state where, time doesn't really exist. Or if it does, it goes incredibly slowly. It's like sort of stepping into a portal, a timeless realm. But other times, maybe at not such a deep level, time goes quite quickly in meditation. So that was really, it just made me really conscious of the temporal aspects of meditation.
But was it actually influencing how you were experiencing consciousness inside your sitting practice?
Not really. No, I didn't. It's a good question, actually, because I've not really pondered over it, but I've not really noticed any changes, but perhaps, without me realizing.
There's a lot of meditators I speak to who are also writers or academics. If there's one consistent distraction that's happening inside their meditation, it's that they're rehearsing what they're about to write or about to teach. And they allow themselves, if they're sitting for an hour, for example, they allow themselves 15, 20 minutes to ponder, seed thought, what it is they're working on. And that's where they actually develop a lot of what they're thinking about. And at the same time, they're having an experience of a slightly expanded consciousness and I was wondering if that's similar to the kind of experience you might have.
Yeah, I mean, I do use meditation in that way. It is that kind of state, that kind of semi-open state when your boundaries are quite soft. It is very fruitful. I do get a lot of ideas in that state. I get sort of poems pop into I write poetry, and a line of a poem will randomly pop into my head when I'm meditating. And also structurally, as you've written lots of books, so you know this, but one of the things about writing books is structure. You have to get the structure right. It's quite difficult. You have this feeling that some parts might be in the wrong place, and I'm thinking to myself, how do I put these parts together? This part, where does it belong? But sometimes in meditation, it just seems to naturally coalesce. I thought, I can see the pattern. The pattern seems to be there. So when I return to my book and open up my computer, it's easy. It just seems to fall into place. I think meditation is great for creativity.
I think that's a perfect example of how meditation functions for a lot of folk, and it pushes the worldview of what meditation is into something much bigger than just having an empty, silent mind. It's
Yeah.
actually a place for huge creativity. And I mean, there's the Buddhist, I've heard Buddhist teachers say that one thing you need in meditation, once you've reached a stable state, is openness and curiosity. You know, what's happening? What's coming to me? What am I experiencing? What does it mean? How do I interpret it? Well, was this just my mind doing all that? You know, it's
Yeah. In fact, if you look back at a lot of the great scientific discoveries in human history, or the great sort of creative endeavors in human history, came from a kind of semi-daydream state when people were just sort of maybe dozing or relaxing, and ideas popped into their minds. You know, it's like a lot of great songs have been written like that too, semi-consciously. So it all comes from that kind of that state of having soft boundaries.
So now that you've finished that book and you're waiting for your editors to come back to you with great news, it's perfect. This is the next seller. Are you taking time off, or have you got another project that's already cooking?
Well, funny enough, I was thinking today, you know, you've probably had this feeling too, that when you finish a book, you feel, what do I do now? It's like your child has left home. Think, what do I do with my free time now? But yeah, I actually enjoy the periods between books because I get quite involved and a little bit obsessive sometimes. So I enjoy sort of chilling out between books, and so I'm going to relax. I've still, you know, got work at university to do. And
do you have a sense of what comes next?
I do. I am aware of a couple of books I want to write, so I'll give myself a bit of a break. Maybe start later in the summer. Start writing my next book. I've got a plan of a couple of books to write.
And in terms of your own, here's a very personal question, which you can again just push back if you don't want to go too deep with it. In terms of your own personal / spiritual development, what are you working on at the moment that's really interesting for you?
At the moment, I want to work on being, because I've been through a period of doing. You know, writing a book is a period of intense activity. So I want to return to being. You know, doing has sort of momentum. You can get caught up in doing. It can be slightly intoxicating when you're busy and feel as though you're achieving things. And it can build up momentum. You can achieve a lot, you know, from that momentum. But I feel as though it's taking me away a little bit from being, from the joy of living purely in the moment and doing nothing in particular. I mean, I always enjoy doing nothing. It's my favorite hobby. But I want to spend a bit more time doing nothing and just sort of, you know, without the pressure of writing a book.
What does it look like when you're doing nothing? What are you doing? What are you hanging out and just sitting on the sofa watching telly, or are you just sitting in the garden?
Maybe listening to music. I love listening to music. Maybe playing my guitar, walking, swimming, things like that. So I guess, you know, I love to lie down and listen to music. That's the closest I get to doing nothing, I guess.
What's your favorite music at the moment for chilling out to?
Oh, wow. I've been listening a lot to a guy I've always liked, but I've been listening to him very intensely recently. A guy called David Crosby from Crosby, Stills and Nash.
Yeah.
But I've always loved his individual stuff. He was such an unusual songwriter, very deep. There's a kind of richness and a deep harmony in his music, which I really relate to. It really transmits a deep harmony because he uses such unusual melodies and chords. So yeah, I've been listening to a lot of his stuff. He was in the Byrds originally, so I've been listening to some of the Byrds.
Yes, I'm going to almost name drop here, but not quite. My oldest friend bought the house that David Crosby had previously lived with, and I lived in, and I used to go and stay there, which was in Mill Valley.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Ah.
Only ever 2 steps away.
Yeah, I knew he lived in Mill. What's that?
You're only ever 2 steps away from someone, aren't you?
Yeah. Who was your friend? Who was your friend?
A guy called Alan, a business person.
Oh, right. I thought it might be. I know your friend Serge, or your old friend Serge. I thought it might have been
Yeah.
Serge, not
Yeah.
Serge. No.
Anyway, listen, it feels like we're coming to the end of the conversation. I think you might have a poem that you'd be prepared to share with us, maybe? Is that right?
Yeah, I'd love to read a poem. It's got very dark here. I think there's a storm coming, so
Okay,
I'm not sure if there is enough light for me to read it. I think with my glasses it should be okay. Oh yeah. I read a poem of mine called The Wave. This is from a book of mine called The Clear Light, Book of Poems and Reflections. And this is a poem that it describes the whole journey of spiritual awakening and also the journey of human life at the same time. It's a kind of allegory. It's called The Wave. The ocean sighed with pleasure as the wind caressed and stroked her, and soon the wave was born. The wave felt his oneness with the ocean. He felt her as his source, as part of his own being, and knew he could never exist apart from her. But soon the wave began to watch himself. He saw his own smooth and graceful motion and was mesmerized. He saw the beautiful bubbling foam that sprayed around him and was transfixed. The wave fell in love with himself. He started to believe that he was his own master, that it was his own strength that was propelling him. He believed he was directing his own flow and could change direction if he wanted. The wave forgot the ocean and saw himself as separate, a self-sufficient, sealess wave. He felt proud of his power, exhilarated by his autonomy as he rolled faster and rose higher. But then he looked around and saw the other waves, the ones who had already peaked and crashed and were beginning to dip and disperse, and the others who were already dissolving and disappearing. The wave felt afraid, realizing that his form was temporary, that his speed and power would ebb away, and soon he would dissolve and disappear as well. The wave felt alone as he sensed the empty space around him and saw the distance between him and the other waves. He felt threatened by the ocean's vastness, now that he seemed to be separate from it. So the wave resisted and rebelled. He tried to build up more momentum, to collect more power, to roll more smoothly, to foam more spectacularly, to make himself so powerful that he would never dissolve away, to make his form so perfect that he could escape decay. But soon he realized that he had no choice, that he had less control than he thought, less strength than he thought. He knew he couldn't resist the flow of life and hold back time and tide. So the wave stopped grasping and pushing and felt the relief of letting go, the freedom of no longer trying. After his majestic foaming rush and the glorious crescendo of his breaking, he gave himself up to his ebbing, fading flow and to the ease of his descent. And he was filled with the joy of acceptance. The wave allowed his boundaries to soften and felt his connection to every other wave and his oneness with the whole of the ocean. He felt the vast wholeness of the ocean within his own being, then as his own being. And then the wave dipped, slowed down, began to dissipate. Quietly and serenely, without fear or resistance, he gave himself to the tide and became the ocean again, knowing that he had never been anything else. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody. I think that's perfect to end this session on that note. So from all of us to you, Steve, many, many thanks for being with us. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
For me too. Thanks, William. Thanks, everybody.